The small countryside town rested in long stretches of open fields and quiet roads, where everyone knew each other's names and business. Life moved slowly there, measured by sunrise chores and sunset dinners, and trouble rarely found a place to settle. At the edge of town stood a wide farm that had been passed down through generations, its fences weathered but strong, its soil rich and carefully tended. Elijah Carter lived there with his wife Ruth, a calm, heavy-set man whose soft voice and gentle manners made most people overlook the quiet strength in his presence. He rose before dawn each day to feed animals, mend posts, and walk the land with pride, while Ruth watched from the porch with warm coffee and sharper awareness of the world beyond their fields. Lately, unfamiliar trucks had begun creeping down the gravel road. Men in polished boots and expensive jackets stared too long at the acreage, whispering into phones and pointing at property lines. A development company had announced plans for luxury homes and shopping centers nearby, and Elijah's land sat directly in the center of their vision. Offers came first, low ones, delivered with fake smiles. When Elijah refused, the smiles faded. At the next town meeting, the tension finally surfaced. In the crowded community hall, one of the developers stood and loudly questioned whether Elijah's family even legally owned the farm. His words dripped with mock concern, but the insult was clear. A few people laughed, others looked away. Ruth stood and calmly cited property records that stretched back more than a century, but the men brushed her off, calling it outdated history that progress needed to erase. Elijah rose slowly, his large frame silencing the room, and said only that his land was not for sale and never would be. The developer smirked, whispering loudly that some people didn't know when to step aside. From that day on, the drive-bys increased. Headlights rolled past the farmhouse late at night. Engines idled near the fence line. Once, Elijah found fresh tire tracks cutting across the back pasture. Another morning, a mailbox lay smashed near the road. Spray-painted slurs appeared on an old barn wall, bright and ugly against the wood. Ruth wanted to call the sheriff immediately, but Elijah quietly photographed everything, writing times and dates in a small notebook. What Ruth, and most of the town, didn't fully know was that before Elijah became a farmer, he had spent 2 decades in elite military operations overseas. He had led missions under fire, learned surveillance, strategy and defense, and survived environments far deadlier than a quiet rural road. He had come home seeking peace, not conflict, but he recognized patterns of escalation when he saw them. Without announcing anything, Elijah began preparing. Motion lights were installed along fence posts, small cameras disappeared into trees and barn rafters, old tool sheds became observation points. Thin wires were set low across common walking paths, and heavy locks replaced the worn ones on doors and gates. Everything blended naturally into the farm so no outsider would notice. Another week passed, then the threats grew bolder. One night, a group of men kicked down a section of fence and left beer bottles scattered across the yard. Another evening, someone hurled rocks through the barn windows. Racial slurs were sprayed again, larger this time, meant to be seen from the road. Ruth's hands shook when she saw them, but Elijah remained calm, documenting every detail with steady precision. "They want fear," he said quietly. "Fear makes people leave." Instead of reacting, Elijah gathered proof. Every voice on the road was recorded, every face that crossed the property line was captured. Every act of vandalism was logged with timestamps and locations. While the town slept, the farm silently watched. To the outsiders, Elijah was just an old, heavy farmer guarding outdated land. To Elijah, the farm had become a controlled space, and the storm he felt building was no longer a surprise. It was a countdown. The calm still hung over the fields, the animals still grazed peacefully, and the sunrise still painted the sky in soft gold. But beneath the quiet surface, preparation had replaced innocence. The men who thought they had found easy prey had no idea they were being studied, recorded, and outmatched long before the real violence began. The farm was no longer just a home, it was ready. The night the violence finally exploded came without warning, thick with heat and the smell of dust and dry grass. Clouds covered the moon, turning the farm into a dark sea of shadows where only the faint glow of distant porch lights broke the blackness. Elijah sat quietly inside the old equipment shed, eyes fixed on the live camera feeds playing across a small monitor. The red dots of motion sensors blinked steadily along the fence line like a silent heartbeat. Ruth waited inside the house with her phone ready, fear heavy in her chest, but trust steady in her mind. They both knew this moment had been coming. Engines cut off near the tree line. One by one, silhouettes moved forward, carrying crowbars, gasoline cans, and rifles slung across their shoulders. Their laughter drifted across the fields, loud and careless. To them, this was entertainment, a lesson for an old man who refused to sell. The first bottle shattered against the barn wall. Flames erupted instantly, crawling up the dry wood with hungry speed. More followed, lighting the night in violent orange. Gunshots cracked through the air as men fired wildly, whooping and shouting slurs, shooting livestock and windows just to hear glass break. Smoke rolled across the fields like a storm cloud. But Elijah didn't move. He watched. Every face was captured in crystal clarity. Every threat was recorded. Every step they took triggered silent sensors feeding into hidden servers far beyond the farm. The attackers spread out, growing bolder as nothing fought back. They believed fear had already won. That was when the farm woke up. Floodlights burst on across the fields, blinding them. Hidden speakers echoed footsteps in the trees, whispers from empty corners, the sound of movement where no one stood. Panic rippled through the group. "What was that?" someone shouted. Before they could regroup, a man tripped over a wire and crashed hard into the dirt. Another followed. In the confusion, shots rang out in every direction, missing everything but shadows. Elijah moved. Despite his size, he slipped through the smoke like a ghost. Years of training guided each step. He struck fast and precise, a chokehold here, a joint lock there, dropping men unconscious before they could cry out. Weapons were kicked away and hands bound quietly in the darkness. They never saw him coming. More traps activated, lights flashed, sirens wailed, smoke canisters rolled across the ground, turning the yard into a maze of fear. The attackers stumbled into each other, firing blindly, screaming warnings that came too late. The leader barked orders near a truck, trying to sound brave, but his voice shook. Confidence had vanished. "This isn't right," one of them yelled. "He's everywhere." That was exactly how Elijah wanted it. From behind, he disabled two more men with swift blows to pressure points that dropped them instantly. Another charged him with a bat, landing a painful hit on his shoulder before Elijah twisted the man's arm and slammed him into the dirt hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. The farm was no longer a target. It was a trap. Within minutes, the group was broken, half unconscious, half fleeing in terror toward their trucks. The leader barely managed to drag one wounded man into the passenger seat before tires screamed down the gravel road. Silence returned slowly, broken only by the crackle of burning wood. Elijah stood in the smoke, breathing steady, body aching but controlled. He had not chased them far. Fear would do more work than fists ever could. Inside the house, Ruth watched the feeds in disbelief, the chaos, the proof, the truth captured from every angle. But relief didn't last long. Sirens approached, not for the attackers, for Elijah. By morning, twisted headlines spread across local news. The story had already been turned inside out. The men who had burned and attacked were described as concerned citizens. Elijah was labeled a violent extremist who had ambushed them with military-style tactics. Police cars surrounded the farm. Officers ignored the burned barn and broken fences. They placed Elijah in handcuffs while cameras rolled. Ruth shouted about evidence. No one listened. As Elijah was pushed into the cruiser, he met his wife's eyes calmly. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The men who attacked him were treated as victims. The man who defended his home was taken away as a criminal. And the storm had only begun. The days after Elijah's arrest felt heavier than the smoke that had once drifted across the farm. News stations replayed edited clips, stripping away the firebombs and gunshots while looping the moments where attackers lay injured on the ground. Commentators called Elijah dangerous, a militant farmer who had snapped. Online posts filled with fear and lies, and strangers drove past the property shouting threats as if justice had already chosen its side. Inside the farmhouse, Ruth refused to be silent. With trembling hands but a steady mind, she searched through backups Elijah had secretly stored across hard drives and hidden memory cards. Every camera angle, every audio file, every time-stamped clip of the men laughing while setting fires and firing weapons appeared one by one on her screen. When she saw the full truth laid out clearly, her grief hardened into resolve. She sent everything, to national news outlets, to civil rights organizations, to veteran advocacy groups, to lawyers who specialized in corruption cases. Within hours, the footage spread faster than any local lie could stop. America watched men hurl fire into a family's barn, scream racial slurs, and hunt livestock like sport. America watched Elijah calmly disable attackers instead of killing them. America saw the manipulation. Outrage ignited. Protests formed outside the jail where Elijah was held. Veterans in uniform stood beside students, pastors, and farmers, carrying signs demanding justice. Social media exploded with calls for investigations. Politicians who had stayed silent suddenly spoke loudly. Federal authorities arrived quietly at first. Then all at once, homes of the attackers were raided before sunrise. Weapons were seized. Phones and computers were confiscated. Financial records uncovered years of land intimidation, arson, threats, and police protection. The so-called development scheme was revealed as a cover for forcing families off property. Even the local sheriff was exposed for burying reports and altering evidence. By noon, handcuffs clicked across the county. Inside his cell, Elijah saw the footage playing on a mounted television. The truth unfiltered at last. Other inmates stared in disbelief. Guards whispered apologies. The narrative had collapsed. That afternoon, a guard unlocked Elijah's door. "You're free, sir." Outside, cheers erupted as he stepped into sunlight. Ruth ran into his arms, sobbing with relief. The crowd chanted his name while cameras flashed. Not as a villain. As a man who stood his ground. Charges against Elijah were dropped immediately. Federal hate crime cases stacked up against the attackers, carrying decades of prison time. Corrupt officials were suspended and investigated. The town that once looked away was forced to face what had lived quietly among them for years. But Elijah didn't celebrate revenge. He went home. The community followed. Volunteers helped rebuild the barn beam by beam. Neighbors brought food, lumber, tools, and supplies. Veterans repaired fencing. Young people scrubbed away hateful graffiti until fresh wood shone beneath it. What had been burned became stronger than before. Ruth announced the creation of a legal foundation to help families facing land intimidation and racial threats. Lawyers offered services. Donations poured in. The farm transformed into a symbol of resistance and protection. Weeks passed, then months. The fields grew green again. Children came to learn how to plant and harvest. Teenagers listened as Elijah taught discipline, patience, and self-respect. The farm became a place of growth instead of fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low over fresh wooden beams, a young boy asked quietly, "Were you scared that night?" Elijah smiled softly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's standing when fear tells you to run." The wind moved gently across the crops. Laughter drifted near the barn. Life had returned stronger than before. The men who thought they had found an easy target had instead awakened a community. And the quiet farm they believed was defenseless had become something far more powerful. A legacy.